There's a basic mistake that a lot of people get wrong about Russia. For years, YouTubers like myself and a whole lot of others have been talking about Russia's economy and how, as a result of their war against Ukraine, they are in dire economic circumstances, not just for one reason, but for about 10 to 100 different reasons. And Russia is also struggling from large attrition, with over 1 million casualties at this point in their war against Ukraine. All signs pointing to the fact that Russia could soon actually collapse as a nation as a result of their war. And if they don't collapse as a nation, at least their economy could collapse to a very large degree, perhaps even large enough to eventually force them to stop their war efforts. But because people have been saying this for so long, and it hasn't happened yet, what a lot of people will say is, well, people have been talking about this, and it hasn't happened, therefore it will never happen. But I would posit to you that people should be asking a different question, or making a different statement, which is to look at all of these people talking about the potential collapse of Russia, and to ask themselves if those reasons are actually valid, which of course they are. When you look at all of the individual reasons, they're valid, and when you look at the combined force of all the different reasons, they are of course even more valid. And so people should look at that and instead make a different statement, which is this. People have been talking about the collapse of Russia for a long time, and all of their points are true based on real data and logically make sense. It hasn't happened yet. Therefore, it is getting more likely every single day. This is, of course, what I believe, and what I have believed for a long time. And I've made a lot of analysis about the fragility of Russia's economy. But one thing that I've never done, and that I really haven't seen any serious analyst ever do, is put a specific time frame or a specific date on Russia's collapse and Russia's economic meltdown. Instead, what we have done is look at the signs and said these signs are real, they're there. Russia can't last forever, and so Russia is getting increasingly weaker. So what I want to do in this video is talk about something else. What I want to talk about today is, why hasn't Russia actually collapsed yet? Because I think if people understand the actual reasons, and if people understand the actual fundamentals that are currently holding up the Russian economy, they can make their own decision about how strong or how shaky those foundations actually are. So let's not waste time, let's get right into it. And as this video progresses, I'm confident that for a whole lot of people, you're going to have a whole lot of aha moments when you realize things that perhaps, for many of you, you haven't heard before. One of the most important things that everybody needs to understand about the war in Ukraine, in particular those who are actually making decisions about this at the policy level, is that when Russia invaded Ukraine, they did not go in without a plan. Now, their plan ended up being completely different from what actually happened, but nevertheless, they went into that invasion with a plan, and that plan is a big part of the reason they've been able to sustain themselves for so long, but that plan is now running extremely thin. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they had a lot of resources that they had stacked up over a long period of time. And in particular, one of the main things that they had accumulated over time was financial resources. And this was largely because of what happened to Russia when they did kind of the first phase of the war against Ukraine, when they invaded and annexed Crimea back in 2014, a long time ago, and they saw how the West responded to that. At the time that Russia annexed Crimea, they were greeted with sanctions from Western nations, and not particularly terrible sanctions, but enough sanctions to do some harm to them. And Russia knew that when they went and fully invaded Ukraine, they would obviously receive even more severe sanctions, because what they were doing this time was many scales higher, many levels higher. And so what Russia did after they annexed Crimea was they began to accumulate money in something that was called Putin's war chest. And they began to accumulate a very large amount of money that seems to have been dedicated for one of two major purposes, probably both. The first was to give them enough finances to withstand whatever amount of sanctions they thought the West would put on them, for a long enough period of time to not just get them through the conflict, but also to get them through the period of sanctions that would follow the conflict. This is an extremely important point. And another plan for this war chest that Russia had saved up as they were preparing for the war against Ukraine, I think was likely to deploy this money into the Russian economy after Russia declared victory. Remember, Russia initially thought that their war would take somewhere between 3 days and 3 weeks to basically fully conquer the entire nation of Ukraine. And I think this was planned to be the first step of a major series of conquests where Russia, if they were successful in that, they would obviously be emboldened and probably would have pushed into other nations within Europe. But in order to do that, they would have needed support from their people. And nothing gets people more supportive of a war than feeling like that war made them personally, financially quite a bit richer. And so I believe that after Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed it as planned, they planned to deploy a large amount of the savings account that they had built up to withstand sanctions also into the pockets of the Russian people so that the Russian people would feel like, hey, war is extremely profitable. We want to do more of this. Now, obviously, this is not what ended up happening, because here we are now, the war is in its 4th year, and Russia still shows no signs of being anywhere close to winning. And so instead of deploying this war chest in the way that they had originally planned, they had to deploy it in other areas. Basically, they had to deploy it to keep their war effort ongoing so they could hopefully eventually achieve victory. And this turned from a big financial boon that would have made the Russian people feel extremely prosperous to basically a band-aid account that they could use to keep going with Vladimir Putin and Russian leadership, hoping that it would be enough for Russia to actually win the war. But now the Russian leadership has a problem. The war is now in its 4th year, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the war chest will not be enough to help them sustain all the way through the war. And this not only means that economically they can't support the war for the long term, but it also means they can't create this artificial feeling of prosperity within the Russian economy that they were planning on. And it also means that they do not have the financial resources to withstand the sanctions that will follow the period of war until nations are basically ready to forgive them for what they've done and lift those sanctions from them. And this isn't just speculation. It's become increasingly clear over the past several years that this war chest is running out. Because when it comes to governments running out of money, there is one sure sign that this is actually happening, which is high inflation. Governments, of course, aren't like normal people like you and me, who can go bankrupt rather easily if we run out of money because we can't print money. Because governments, of course, can print money in their own currency. And the main problem that indicates that a government is printing a lot of money is if there is a very high inflation rate. And this is, of course, exactly what we have seen in Russia, with them sort of doing everything they can to kind of battle this inflation rate, whether that be with incredibly high interest rates that basically make it impossible for Russian people to borrow money and purchase things, or other signals like that. As far as this goes, one of the most significant things that we've seen in recent days is that Vladimir Putin has recently actually had to come out in front of the Russian people and basically promise them that he would lower the Russian military budget next year. And this is really a severe sign of decay in Russia's ability to continue conducting their war, regardless of whether or not Vladimir Putin is telling the truth. Because it indicates a couple of things. First of all, the Russian people know that the war effort is a big cause for the inflation. Number two, they're not happy about the inflation. Number three, Vladimir Putin feels pressure from the Russian people being upset about this inflation, and he knows that he can only do this for so long. And so if you cannot print more money to keep funding your military action, eventually you would be forced to actually reduce your military budget or undergo severe economic collapse and lose the war anyways. And we see Vladimir Putin potentially, or at least telling his people, that he will move towards actually reducing that military budget, indicating that the financial situation of the Russian government is far worse than the Russian people would be led to believe by their government in the years leading up to this. This is incredibly significant for quite a few reasons. And the number one reason is that the financial approach has been the primary way that Vladimir Putin has been supporting his war effort. In particular, Vladimir Putin has been choosing to recruit soldiers to fight against the Ukrainians with basically bribes of large stacks of cash, rather than conscripting people and forcing them to fight against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin seems to know that large-scale conscription within Russia would be more than Russian society is willing to bear, more than Russian society is willing to handle. And he probably fears for his own regime if he tries to do that on large scale, and so he's been using the financial tactic. But again, we see that the financial tactic is now winding down. And what I would compare this to make it easy to understand in terms of personal finances, again, going back to the period of preparation before the war, is if you personally financially wanted to create a period in your life where it seemed like you had incredibly high prosperity. And so for a couple of years, you set aside a portion of your income, let's just say 10 to 15%, which is kind of roughly the numbers that the Russian government was looking at too. You took that 10 to 15% and you invested it in a retirement account or in a savings account. And then you reached this period where you left your job, so you now had no more income coming in. But while you left that job and you had no more income coming in, you took all of this money that you had saved up in this retirement account over many years and you deployed it into your lifestyle all at once. So you went out and you bought yourself a brand new car, maybe a brand new house. You started eating out for dinner every single night, all this good stuff. To a lot of people looking on, it would appear like you were very rich at this period of your life, and maybe even your children, if you had them, would think, wow, mom or dad is doing really well financially. But of course, that would be a lie. It would be based on previous year's savings. And once that money runs out, you really have no hope of any future. And you're just hoping that people don't think about that. That is kind of the position that the Russian government is in now. They saved up a lot of money over time. They deployed that into their economy to keep their war effort going. But because their war effort is costing them money and also costing them income because of sanctions, their economy is increasingly winding down and could no longer support this burden. Now, there is a lot of data to support this, and it's not just mere speculation. For example, all of this is supported by the Russian GDP growth, or at least what they have published as Russian GDP growth, over the period that Russia has actually been at war, which is, of course, just flatly on its face nonsensical, at least in terms of real growth. Because while Russia is at war, they are, of course, in a period of time where they are investing a lot of resources in fighting, so they are spending a lot more, while they have less income coming in because of sanctions. And even if people say Russia has been resilient to sanctions, I don't think anybody would honestly argue that Russia is making more money with sanctions than they could make without sanctions. And yet Russia has been claiming that their GDP has been growing the entire time they are at war, and this data supports that. The reason that Russia's GDP could grow if it were true, which I think there's a good chance that Russia is fudging a lot of that data, but even if it were true, would be because they deployed all of the savings that had been kind of being taken out of their GDP, not being invested in their economy, and invested it all at once, but they're not investing it in productive capacities. They're investing it in military equipment that basically just goes and gets destroyed right after that money is spent. And this explains that while Russia says their GDP is growing, their economy is growing, when we look at the largest banks in Russia that do most of the investment in actual long-term sustainable growth, a lot of them are saying, like, we haven't had a single new infrastructure investment project this entire year, which of course doesn't make sense if you're trying to claim that your economy is actually growing with sustainable growth. But it does make sense if you are taking money that had been saved up and deploying it in the economy, making it look like the GDP has grown when in reality you've just spent money on a war and attributed that money you spent on a war to your GDP. So Russia prepared for their war, and because they prepared for their war, they are able, or were able, to sustain several years of the conflict that we've seen so far, something that I think pretty much every analyst Every serious analyst has said was the case. But those preparations are running thin, and Russia is not getting enough income or investment to make up for the losses. And so they are whittling down the savings account very quickly. So yes, eventually their economy will crumble under this weight, even though it hasn't crumbled yet. We see exactly what the reason for that is, and when we understand the actual reason for that, we realize how that doesn't make Russia look stronger. It actually makes them look more vulnerable in the long term. And even more than that, the nation of Russia, the Vladimir Putin regime, is also shown to be vulnerable in the midst of all of this. We've seen that he is afraid of the Russian people when it comes to economic collapse. But we also have seen that Vladimir Putin is afraid of the Russian people when it comes to conscription, which is why he created the conditions that could lead to economic collapse in the first place. And so Vladimir Putin has no way to continue his war without provoking the Russian people in either one or maybe both ways. That can be sustained for a certain period of time. Nobody knows exactly how long. But what everybody should be able to tell just from using a common sense approach is that it cannot last forever. Now keep in mind that in this video, I've only focused on a rather limited set of economic problems that Russia is facing, and I haven't even focused on like the military problems. I have other videos going in a lot of depth on other economic issues, not even mentioned here because it might take me 20 minutes to fully explain those, that are contributing to this same issue and making it even worse. And all of this kind of comes together and makes the situation exponentially worse. And so whatever one thinks about Russia, whatever one thinks about their current level of strength, what nobody should believe and what no policymaker should believe is that Russia can just continue fighting forever and ever and ever and ever. Russia does have a limit. They can only push themselves so far. They can only push Ukraine so far. And it is becoming increasingly clear that they are getting increasingly closer and closer and closer to that actual hard limit. And what Ukraine needs to do is endure and sustain. And what their Western partners need to do is to continue to help to give them the strength to do that. Now, if you appreciated this video and you thought that I touched on issues that you don't really hear discussed in mainstream media, there's a reason for that. I'm an independent analyst, and I don't draw a salary from a newspaper or from any other organization. That gives me a lot of freedom of thought, a lot of freedom to follow the facts wherever they lead without feeling constrained by a particular narrative or a particular goal of that organization. If you appreciate that approach and you want to continue to support future videos like this, you can support this channel by becoming a patron. It's completely voluntary, but I do really appreciate all of my patrons who make my work possible, and I am so thankful for all of you who have contributed on a regular basis to this channel. That is a very large reason why I have been able to produce so many more videos that I hope policymakers are watching and that are helping to influence the narrative of Ukraine with actual facts and actual data and not just politically motivated opinions. With that in mind, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.